On the 25th of December 1066, William of Normandy was crowned King of England. He was coronated in Westminster Abbey, and the people within the Abbey, it seems according to the story, start to celebrate. And when they are celebrating, William's men outside misunderstand what's going on, and they attack and start to burn down many of the houses around Westminster Abbey. This story is very much symbolic of the reputation that William I has. He has a long list of misdeeds. His brutal repression of Anglo-Saxons, particularly the harrying of the North, is well documented. The actual Battle of Hastings itself, again, more bloodshed, but he does build Battle Abbey, so he's really, really sorry about that one. And of course, we have the fact that William, to try and entice Harold Godwinson to actually engage in battle and make a mistake, William orders a lot of his men to essentially burn down villages on their way to the battle site. So William does have a very long list of stories connected to him regarding his use of violence. There are even stories from before William gets to England. Again, a famous story talks about how William is so outraged when he's laying siege to a particular town that they insult his mum, so he chops off the hands of everyone within the village. Again, these are the kinds of stories that are connected to William I. Even the story of how he began to court his eventual wife, Matilda of Flanders, the story involves him either bursting into her bedchamber and pulling her by her braids, or meeting her on the way to church and pulling her by her braids and treating her in a very unkind manner. So he doesn't have the best reputation. That is an understatement, and with good reason. But often what we think about when we think about William is we think about the man that he becomes, the man who is willing and able to use violence to brutally, bring people to heel, who is constantly, fighting with the Anglo-Saxon population that he is trying to control. And sometimes we get so wrapped up in the man that William becomes that we forget the child that he was. And as a child, William, Duke of Normandy, had an incredibly tragic and brutal uprising. Let's get into it. Firstly, let's start with his parentage. I don't want to put too much stock in the fact that he was illegitimate, because it's unclear how much that would have actually held him back. Illegitimacy does not seem to be much of a barrier in the 11th century, particularly as if we look to England, for instance, as an example, they didn't have any issue, the English nobles, as it were, they don't have any issue in terms of putting their support behind somebody who is illegitimate for the crown if they felt that person was the best person for the job. Okay, that the parentage doesn't seem too much of a factor. However, the idea that she was low-born, possibly that might have caused him some, trauma. No one's like people calling their mum names. So yeah, that definitely could be a thing, because we don't know exactly what her background was. There are these very romantic stories of his mother being spotted by his dad, Robert, Duke of Normandy, when she's like washing her clothes in a river or she's dancing, and it's a very sort of romanticized story. The probable truth is that she was the daughter of somebody who was connected to Robert, and she wasn't particularly low-born at all. She was just somebody who he happened to come into contact with, and they liked each other a lot, and one thing led to another, and 9 months later baby William was born. So I'm not going to go too much into whether or not the illegitimacy was something that caused a great amount of trauma. But I think it is important to note that his dad, Robert, Duke of Normandy, wasn't the eldest. He wasn't supposed to inherit the Duchy of Normandy. However, there seems to be a bit of a dispute between him and his older brother Richard over Normandy, and Richard was killed, possibly murdered, possibly by Robert, and there had been some chaos within Normandy, which I think is somewhat important context to note with regards to where Normandy was in the broader political spectrum. So William is born into this environment. His dad, Robert, Duke of Normandy, is the Duke and possibly has some things that he needs to atone for. So in 1035, he is on a journey to the Holy Land, and this is the first very big, pivotal, tragic moment for our young William, because this is the moment where his dad dies. He goes off to the Holy Land and he just doesn't return. William is approximately 7 years old at this point, and he's not now just having to deal with the fact that he has lost his father. He now has to deal with the fact that he is the Duke of Normandy, and with all the pressures that that brings for him. Initially, there seems to be some stability, aside from what we can only speculate, which is the amount of grief and devastation that 7-year-old William must have felt. But in terms of business as usual, a lot of the policies that Normandy had seem to be continuing. And Mark Morris talks about how the reason for this is probably because of William's grand uncle or great uncle, which was the bishop. The bishop was absolutely very responsible for William at this time and was doing a lot of the administrative works around Normandy. And it seems reasonable for us to make the assumption that it was the bishop who was making a lot of the big decisions and was making sure that William was growing up with the appropriate protection, as was befitting somebody who was the Duke of Normandy. However, the bishop was super old by this point and is not long for this world. So 1037, he unfortunately dies. And this puts William in a much, much more vulnerable situation. Following the death of the bishop, we have two counts who take over the sort of the protectorate, if you will, of William, Duke of Normandy. One of them is Count Alan of Brittany, and the other one is Count Gilbert of Brionne. Now, these two individuals are the ones who are going to basically be there to protect William, to make sure that Normandy is being run in the appropriate way and that he is being safeguarded, because of course he's still quite a small child at this point, so he needs to be protected. Alan dies in a siege in 1040. And then Gilbert is killed, assassinated, whilst he was out hunting. Then, shortly after, William's tutor is also murdered. And then to make things even worse, we have Osbert, the steward of William, who was sleeping in the same room as William. He's murdered whilst William is sleeping in that room. He has his throat slit. And we can only speculate what William actually experienced with this event. We don't know, or I certainly don't know, if William witnessed the event actually whilst it was taking place, or if this is a case that he wakes up and sees that Osbert has been murdered. But this must have been, once again, we have this over a very short period of time, tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and this must have absolutely created within William a very sort of insecure, terrifying, fragile existence. Like I find it very difficult to kind of envision a world where William goes through all this and isn't deeply traumatized and doesn't feel incredibly unsafe. Normandy itself, by this point, is now descending into chaos, and there's a really interesting quote in the Mark Morris book which kind of symbolizes exactly what had happened. So let me just quickly find it. So, as Mark Morris tells it, the duchy rapidly descended into violence as magnates struggled to gain the upper hand against their rivals. A well-informed 12th century writer called Odoric Vitalis tells the story of the unfortunate William Guillot, I hope I'm saying that correctly, who was seized by his enemies at a wedding feast, taken outside and horribly mutilated. His nose and ears cut off, his eyes gouged out. Normandy seems to have experienced a rash of mafioso-style killings as powerful families used any methods against each other, knowing that the government of the young Duke William was powerless to protect or punish them. Which, again, demonstrates to us how horrendous and how difficult things must have been for this young Duke William. All of this takes place before he's 13 years old. So I guess the question is, why? Why are there so many people who are close to William being taken out, being murdered? The answer is probably Henry I of France. He was very much getting himself involved within Norman affairs, and the relationship between the King of France and Normandy is an interesting one. They absolutely needed and were codependent on each other. Henry I did not want William to be removed from Normandy. He wanted the young Duke to remain as Duke, but he didn't want people surrounding William to have any sort of anti-Henry motives. So Henry I needed Normandy. He needed Normandy on side, and he needed Normandy to be controlled. It's remarkable to think this young boy and the trauma and the tragedy that he had experienced. Many of those people will have been very close. And we have a lot of stories. William apparently said on his deathbed, although this might be a fabrication, but he talked about how when he was growing up, he had to go and he had to hide in the houses of different people, of these like common folk, and he had to go with his uncle Walter, and he had to hide in those areas because it wasn't safe for him to be it wasn't safe for him to be in his own castle. That part could be true, but William probably was safe himself because Henry I needed him. He needed to have William. He wanted William to be the Duke of Normandy, and he wanted to make sure that all the people who were around William were pro-France and were not going to do anything that went against Henry I's plans. And I cannot begin to imagine what impact these may have had on him. And perhaps this might help us to understand the man that he will go on to become. Anyway, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for sticking around and getting to the end of this video. I hope you found it informative, and I just find this topic so fascinating. So please do let me know in the comments below in terms of your thoughts on this particular topic. What kind of impact do you think this would have had on him? Is there anything that I've missed out that you think would be a really important part of William's sort of childhood and understanding the man that William will go on to become? But no, thank you so much once again, and I'm looking forward to catching you in the next one. Bye!